Hello and welcome. Today we're going to be discussing gangs and delinquency. In order to address this, I had to ask myself, is this even a relevant lecture in modern times in the United States? Are we seeing a big decrease in gang activity? Are we seeing a decrease in organized crime and things along those lines? And the answer is yes, in the United States, but I don't know if that really holds over globally. And then again, if we're going to look at the United States specifically, we could look at it from different time frames. So as I was thinking about giving this lecture, and I was like, yes, gangs might not be as intense today, but they really were in the 90s. Okay, and then we also had gangs in the 1920s, and then we also had gangs in the late 1800s, like if you watch Martin Scorsese's Gangs in New York, or if you study the rise of the five families in New York with the mafia. They all start out as street gangs, like Lucky Luciano, Al Capone. I mean, they all start out as street gang members. So if you look back at American history and you look back at the history of street gangs, and then, are they race-based gangs? Are they ethnic-based gangs? Is it poverty-based gangs? And then how do we define a gang? And again, it just starts getting very, very broad. But then if we look globally in modern times, like Haiti currently just got taken over for gangs. There's whole countries that are run by mafias, for example. And so how we define gangs in America, we usually kind of think about the typical street gangs, like studying the street gangs in Chicago in the 1960s and 70s. There's just so much deep history there, and all these gangs have all these wild names. And I mean, if you just get on YouTube and look up like Chicago street gangs in the 1960s and 70s, for example, I mean, like, just fascinating stuff. Also, a lot of murder, drug dealing, and all those other kinds of things too. But again, it's like, do we see that in modern times, the US, like we did back in the day? And again, right now, we're just kind of at that epic where everybody's got their technology, and you've seen a huge reduction in crime in general. So if you look at crime stats by decade, from the 1960s to the 1990s, crime rose. But then from the 90s, 2000s going to modern time, crime is down by half, which means it's back to like the 1960s levels. But, why is that the case? And so again, during different epochs, you have different reasons for gang activities. Like you had the early Irish and Italian gangs of New York, for example, or that spread out. And that comes out of economic oppression and dealing with prejudice and discrimination and lack of access. But after a couple generations, people start to assimilate a little bit better, and then you see a reduction in those types of gangs. Then in the 1990s, you see a lot of inner city gangs. That resulted from white flight in the 1960s when they integrated the schools. White people didn't want to go to school with black people, so all the white people that had money moved out to the suburbs, created the high tax districts. The cities then, all the people that had money that would be paying into the taxes of the city had moved out, and what you were left with was poor whites, poor blacks, poor Hispanics, and the cities were very rough. Okay. And so if you look at like New York City in the 1970s, like the CBGBs, the punk rock movement, all of these things kind of come out of that era of economic, depression, essentially, and then racism and subjugation and all these other things that confound it. And then, as we got our technology and the economy seems to be doing a little bit better in the US and more access to jobs and higher paying wages and whatever it might be, you start to see a reduction in gangs. And that's what you have in modern times. But that's not to say that gang violence isn't still real. So again, I don't want to go off on too big of a tangent, but a good place to start with gangs is one, just take a historical perspective. Break it down by decade or by century or by type of gang, and then kind of look at it by region and look at it by region in modern times versus the past and see if there's differences. You can be looking at just variables like that. So you can get a general understanding of the history of gangs in America for, centuries. And again, just go back. There's a history. Every race has a gang. Every ethnicity has a gang at some point. Every group of poor people have a gang at some point. I mean, it's just like, so that just to introduce it. So again, I did have to ask that question though, is this still relevant in modern times? And in the end, the book says, there's about 850,000 gang members still in America, which is, significantly less than it was back in the day, but that's still, a portion of the population. And then juveniles are subjected to this. And so while we might think of crime and just general crime as being much more prevalent than gang related crime, still the impact of gang related crime is very high, and we have to think about it. And again, it's like, do we open the door now into the entire structure of the criminal underworld, from the, land owning cocaine producers to the shippers to the receivers to the distributors down to the users? I mean, and that's kind of how you have to break it down. And then, so a lot of the crime, for example, that's coming out of gang, drug, interaction comes from these users who then get addicted to drugs, and then they go to Walmart and steal because they need $50 to go get their heroin fix or whatever it might be. And so what you see here is like an entire system. And so gangs is just part of a larger system of maybe counterculture, deviant behavior. Some of it's organized, some of it's not. Some gang behavior is like very organized and under the radar, and some of it's very overt. Again, and then we have to break this out by type of gang. Like, are we talking about the mafia, where you have like the Dapper Don who's very, out there? Or we could talk about some of the 1950s mobsters like Frank Costello, who nobody ever got, and then, or are we talking about these street gangs like we think about with like 1990s and the crack epidemic and Bloods versus Crips? And so again, it's a little bit complex, but what we're really focusing on for this lecture is this idea of this organized, group of people that are engaging in illicit forms of behavior, you know. And so how we define that, it can be very broad. Again, are we looking at mobs? Are we looking at street gangs? Are we looking at the 14-year-old hood kids who just come up and then just attack the rich people and then run back to the hood? I mean, that's a thing that Chicago had not too long ago. You had these kids that were coming out of rough neighborhoods. They get off the train, they'd rob all the rich people on the north side, and they hop back on the train, and they would all wear the same clothes and stuff like that, so that nobody ever really knew who they were. And that kind of stuff happens. Like when I moved to Columbus, there was, from the south side, the kids would come up, like whole groups of 14-year-old kids, and just attack people in the park. Like it was completely random, but you're like, is that even real? But it is. But again, how do these 14-year-old kids get exposed to that life anyhow? And again, if you look at the south side of Columbus during that time, it was a very rough area. And again, where there's rough areas, do you start to see increases in crime, drugs, gang activity, things along those lines? And so again, I could introduce this concept for days. We could be here forever talking about the history of gangs, all the different types of gangs, where they're concentrated. But again, just do some research on that. Please, if you're interested in gangs, even if it's something you want to do for like a final project, just pick a starting place. I've had my runs. I love the mafia history. Again, I love my Chicago gangs because I grew up in Chicago. And if you look at uptown Chicago, like in the 70s, it was rough. Just burnt out cars on the streets, drug dealing everywhere. I remember being a kid walking through Chicago like a little kid, and people would just be offering drugs on the streets while you walk by, and like, and that you don't see that in modern times. I mean, I remember being young, and that was just stuff that you would see walking around Chicago, for example. So again, different times maybe, or everyone just got their phones and they just quit doing drugs. Because again, drug use in general is also down by half, even though opioids and overdose deaths are just through the roof. But again, that started with the doctors over prescribing, and then you had the fentanyl and the gangs coming in and selling the fentanyl. And so again, are gangs associated with the overdose deaths? Of course. Who's distributing this kind of stuff? You know what I mean? Do gangs have territories? And then who are they interacting with? And your book gets into like the cartels and the technological use of the use of technology and how they distribute. I mean, it gets a little bit deep, so I don't want to like waste all day. This lecture could go on for days, so I'm just trying to introduce you some of these ideas. But again, the goals of this chapter are to summarize what is known about the extent of gang activity and different types of gangs in the United States. And hopefully I'm just introducing you that it's incredibly broad. You got to take it by decade, by region, by country, by type of activity, by type of gang. Are we talking street gangs, mafia gangs? How organized? Is it super formal and bureaucratized, or is it much more loose? Is there competition in the gangs? Are they a violent gang? Are they just like a bunch of protesters? You never know, right? We're going to be looking at some of the theories and nature of gang formation. Why do people join gangs? Why do gangs form in the first place? Why do people socially construct gangs? What's the purpose of creating a gang? Describe how the life course perspective views gang membership. Again, looking at how gang membership is associated with outcomes later on in life. Summarize strategies for preventing and controlling gangs. We'll look at some social policies that can conclude. But again, we should be asking ourselves, why do young people join gangs? And what does the gang provide as members that other social institutions don't? Again, if society was functioning perfectly, people wouldn't have to create these deviant gangs, you know? There's the reason these people aren't buying into society. One, they're either blocked access because of socioeconomic, racial, ethnic oppression, things along those lines. Um, or they just wouldn't really join gangs, unless they're just out for power or something along those lines. So we'll get into that a little bit. All right, so again, what do street gangs and organized crime get involved with? Of course, drug distribution, guns, auto theft, prostitution, gun running, extortion. You always see the gambling halls and all the classic mob movies, that kind of thing. But again, why are these people forming these organizations to get in on this? One, yes, they could go into legitimate business, but maybe their life led them into some other direction. That legitimate business either was a choice, they didn't want anything to do with it, or they just didn't have access to get themselves into legitimate businesses, so they find themselves in these types of activities, or they just find themselves in the life. And again, I mean, this is like an entire other lecture, but just think about it. Think about the life. Think about that culture. Think about where you grow up, that you get exposed to gangs, that you get exposed to organized crime. Is this like just some nice, happy, suburban neighborhood where everybody's got money and good cars? Where do you see the concentrations? And so again, you're going to see the highest concentration in these urban areas, but also in these urban areas, you're going to have mass inequality between rich, middle class, and poor. And so again, depending upon where you're growing up, what kind of a lifestyle are you falling into? Are you falling into that college track? Or are you falling into the lower class workforce track? you know and it can be things like the education system filters you out. Depending upon how well you can succeed at the education system, that dictates your socioeconomic status, your ability to rise up in the class system. And what if you're an immigrant coming over and you don't have access to this kind of stuff? How do you think Al Capone and Lucky Luciano got in on this, right? They started out with the street gangs, then they got introduced to the more adult formalized gangs, then they assassinated the head of the gang. Then they took over the gang and just distributed out who's going to take over what part. And that's how you end up with the five families, for example, right? Or if you look at like the 1980s Crips and Bloods, well, you have this massive influx of drugs, of cocaine and crack, and then the mixing of crack, and then having to distribute that. And I mean, who ends up taking over that whole system, right? And so you have these gangs that kind of arise out of that need to bureaucratize and formalize the distribution and sale and receiving of drugs, for example. And so your book gets a little bit into that. But again, how do you fall into that life in the first place? How do you meet people that have access to cocaine and crack? All right. So again, you have to open your eyes to what this world looks like. As I was reading your book, the authors just seemingly are a bit ignorant about this, right? The way that culture, the way you're socialized, who you're exposed to, how this is associated with the life decisions you end up making and your overall life outcomes. Again, if you don't get your kids into that good tax district with the good schools, is that associated with their outcomes and whether or not they're likely to commit crimes? And the answer is yes. It is not a fair society. All right. So the United States has over 30,000 different gangs and 850,000 gang members. Again, they mostly are in urban areas. This is then followed by the suburbs, small cities, and rural counties, and your book has a picture of that to show you. But again, the largest percentage of gang activity is in these cities, tending to be in the lower socioeconomic kind of areas. And lower class culture, let's just discuss it in a harsh way, but lower class culture is associated with it. And you can look at things like social class reproduction. We generally reproduce the same social classes from generation to generation. Albeit you can have social mobility in the United States, people don't tend to really move up and down as much as you might think in the United States. Again, your parents' socioeconomic status is very predictable of your overall life outcomes, your life chances, your access, your opportunities to get health care and education and a nice vacation and a good house and a car. So your book, I'm going to read the long version because again, I've opened it up that a gang is arbitrary in how we define it. Are we talking about mafias? Are we talking about street gangs? Are we talking about just organized 14-year-olds taking on the city? The book defines it as an interstitial, meaning an inner, like a tight knit group that interacts, formed by spontaneously, maybe out of some random need. Although I kind of argue with that because again, usually there's like we need this. That's why we're making it. It's not so spontaneous. And then integrated through conflict, meaning they have to compete to get their little niche. It is characterized by the following types of behavior: meeting face to face, milling, movement through space as a unit, conflict, and planning. The result of this collective behavior is the development of a tradition, unreflective internal structure, a spirit de corps, solidarity, morale, group awareness, and attachment to local territory. Basically, they're forming an entity and then they're attaching a cultural way of life to that entity, right? And then that cultural way of life dictates acceptable behaviors, cultural norms, how we're going to dress, how we're going to talk, how we're going to walk, and the way of life that we're all going to conform to. And of course, then the attachment to that group, to that territory that they control, whatever it might be. Okay, so again, much longer version. General profiles of gang members. About 10% of gang members in general are juveniles, which is why we're talking about it. But again, you get introduced to this stuff as kids. You don't just like, come out of high school one day at like 23, like I got out of college, like I think I'm going to go join a gang. Again, you get socialized into this way of life from youth, okay? That's the way it is in life. 180 to 1,000 members is generally what the book says about how many people generally belong to each gang, and about 25 people generally belong to these drug trafficking gangs. But again, what attracts people to gangs? And so your book basically says social discrimination or rejection. They have lack of access, so they just feel like they're not going to be accepted in the first place, so they just turn to crime. Absence of family, positive adult role models, and having discipline. Again, we all need a little bit of control. We need people to guide us. You know, that's just part of it. And then you could also have the trauma and rough family lives and things along that included in that. Having a sense of powerlessness, experiencing abuse, fear, and lack of security. Again, that struggle with the family, trouble at home. Where do they look to? Economic deprivation. Again, lack of access, lack of belief in what they can achieve. School failure. Again, that correlation between school failure and making decisions that lead to lives of crime. Having low self esteem. Again, if they don't really believe in themselves, they're not getting access, they're going to seek out that confidence somewhere else. Lack of acceptable rite of passage into adulthood, meaning they're struggling to just get a job and being able to take care of their family, so they're like, the hell with it. Lack of free time activities. Maybe they're just bored. That's why I think the cell phone comes in because people aren't just on the streets anymore like they used to. They don't interact with people. This generation spends 1/3 less time with people than my generation did. People are on their phones. That's why they're not committing as many crimes. I swear. Pathological needs, meaning looking at the psychological traits that are associated with violent activity, engaging in that kind of stuff. Being exposed or influenced by other gang members. Again, how do you even get exposed to learning how to sell crack? I mean, you have to be around these people. Mass media portrayal, portraying it as cool, like Boys in the Hood, even though it's a really dark and sad movie and people die. Following in other people's footsteps. Again, if you have people that are doing it, you're just modeling and imitating their behavior. And then the ability to join. Do you have access to the gangs? Your book also busted out gangs in schools. Again, in my time, we didn't have mass shootings like you do these days with these AK-47s. You had these gang violence in the 90s. Now, the gang violence in the schools has absolutely gone down, but the mass shootings are just through the roof. So you can kind of see over here, the 90s would be like way up here, and now it's like down here. So, a little bit of up and down in 2005 and then back down here again. But, gangs in schools has significantly reduced, but even so, 30% of students say that they have seen some kind of gang, in their school at some point or somebody that was associated with gangs. Like when I grew up, yeah, you just saw people all over the place that joined gangs. They were just part of gangs. That was just like a normal way of life. I don't see that anymore in modern times in the United States, but again, that's not so much in other countries. So again, gangs in schools are associated with economic and social structures of the community. So think about it. Where are the gangs present? They don't tend to be in these excellent, high quality schools. Okay, so again, lower class, high poverty schools tend to have higher rates of this because they're more exposed to a culture of crime and poverty. Okay. You might have a gang tradition already within that school. Are gangs involved in drug trafficking in that school? Gang members are more likely to bring a gun to school, and they're also more likely to own and carry a gun. They recruit constantly with fraternity obligation through coercion. But again, remember, kids are vulnerable. The youth are vulnerable. You don't really have a chance to even think about stuff until you're like 25, until your prefrontal cortex is fully developed. So again, if you get socialized in this way of life and this becomes your way of life, again, that's how you end up in this kind of way of life. And then who's more likely to end up in that way of life? Those growing in poverty or racial and ethnic minorities that are absolutely stuck in poverty because of racism and all the other factors. Um, yeah, so gangs in school it has reduced, but still kids are seeing it. Law violating behaviors in general, people that join gangs are more likely to be involved in delinquent acts across the lifespan, and that's just something that we should take from this. So I put it in really large letters. Again, race ethnicity is a huge factor. Historically, whites were the most likely to be gang members. Again, all those early gang members, like the Irish, the Italian, they didn't start out as white people, but over time, white as a culture or as a racial group, even though they're not biologically similar, that's not how. All right, that's not how it works. I'm not going to talk about race today. Watch my lecture on race and why you're not actually a white person or black person biologically, but you are culturally or ethnically because we socially constructed these categories. Yada yada yada. But historically, you had those Italian, those Irish gangs, and things along those lines. But over time, again, as these groups had better access to rising up the social class ladder, you saw a drastic reduction in that. Now, in modern times, you see Hispanic or Latino are the most likely to be part of gang members. 40% of gang members are Hispanic Latino, 33% are black. Again, white historically was number one, but now they're down to only 12%. And then your book gets a little bit into the Asian gangs and things along those lines. Like, it's like reminds me of Fast and the Furious. Again, how does media portray gangs? But again, where do Asian gangs come out of? They come out of the subjugation of California when they come over on the railroads, and then we strip them of their citizenship and we don't give them access, right? I don't know if you guys watch like Ip Man or, the Bruce Lee and like the whole history of Asian gangs and kung fu and karate and like there's a whole awesome history there. Please check that out. But again, we don't have all day to be getting into deep into the Asian gangs. But fascinating story there. Again, same thing with Chicago gangs. I could talk about this all day, but I'd be boring you. We're already so many minutes in. All right. So race and ethnicity is associated with it again, but why? It's not because they're Hispanic that they're joining gangs. It's because they're Hispanic and they're subjugated into the lower classes. If you oppress entire groups of people and then you attach negative stigmas to groups of people and you make it so they can't access a good education and a good job like everybody else, you're gonna see higher rates of this, okay? All right. So theories, again, if you're socialized into this way of life, if this is your cultural way of life, it's a normal part of growing up. Again, it's like differential association theory. If it's normal, then everyone else is doing it, then you don't even think about it. Strain theory, again, through economic depression, growing up in poverty, that's associated with it. Subculture, being exposed to that culture, whatever it might be. You have several theories of that. Social disorganization theory, again, society is not meeting the needs of all the social classes. Therefore, you have these countercultures trying to meet their needs in some other way. Underclass theory, again, growing up in the lower classes is associated with higher rates of gang activity, drug abuse, all of these things. Not alcoholism, though. Alcoholism's the opposite. And I asked why, and my students one day said it's because alcohol is more expensive than drugs. And then I got to thinking, is that accurate? I'm still looking into it. And then again, looking at the larger social context, looking at how social, economic, and cultural forces push and pull us in specific directions. But again, gang membership across the lifespan, gang membership predicts a trajectory. Okay? Just like committing crimes when you're young, or growing up in an abusive family, or experiencing sexual trauma, or any of these things that can happen that can lead us down this path. Okay, gangs is just one of those variables. All right. So regarding social policies, some things that we found some effect, community organization is a huge factor. Again, that community accountability is like the number one way to really hold people accountable. You don't want to say call the police, but when the grandmas call this is bad. I actually got to take all this back. Because again, what happens when the grandma calls the police nowadays? Well, then the police come and they end up shooting the people. So again, it's like crap. Now I gotta like take back what I'm saying because of so much police violence, and someone gets called for a mental health call and they wind up dead in modern times. So I have to completely take back what I'm saying. So not necessarily calling the police, but that grandma on the street corner holding the kids accountable, like that has an effect. It sounds silly, but it really does. Like having the parents knowing where the kids are and what they're doing and structuring their behavior. Not completely, I'm not saying totally control the kids, but kids need some of that. Again, mobilization, enabling people to rise up the social class ladder, move into better neighborhoods, get better jobs, networking. Social intervention, focusing on individual behavioral and value changes, looking at opportunities provisions, emphasizing the improvement of education, training, and job openings for youth. Again, improve the economy, get them off the streets, create a better culture that's more positive, more productive, reduce racism and ethnocentrism and other forms of subjugation, stop, police targeting, stop incarcerating so many black men over petty crimes, which then gets them in the system, which then further reduces their ability to get a good job in education, all of these things. Supervising gang members. These are just some of the suggestions that your book is throwing out there. But again, if you really want to create, a reduction in overall crime, what do you do? It's all about building and growing and giving people some sense of belief and giving people access. Again, education is the number one way to end poverty, but just getting a job, education or getting a job, any of these things helps out so much. Having good role models, growing up in a positive community, growing up in a place that's not economically depressed, just many, many things that we've been talking about through this class for how to reduce crime and delinquency in general. But all right, so that's just a quick introduction. Again, there's tons of cool stuff. You can go in so many directions when it comes to gangs. So have fun with it, and I wish you all the best.